Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Conflict in Sudan: Background, Realities, and Possible Futures. I'm Justin Williams, Associate Professor of History and Director of the African American Studies program here at University of Detroit Mercy. And we want to thank you for attending this session on perhaps the most urgent humanitarian crisis in the world today. Before Professor Christopher Tounsel provides us with important information on the crisis and offers us perspective on the country's uncertain path forward, our wonderful Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, Jacqueline Barichka, would like to offer some words of welcome to you, our amazing audience. Dean Jacqueline.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Justin. On behalf of the College and University of Detroit Mercy, I am thrilled to welcome you all here this evening. Tonight, we are so excited to have Professor Christopher Tounsel from the University of Washington here to discuss the conflict in Sudan, background, realities, and possible futures. This event is sponsored by the African American Studies program in the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Thank you so much, Professor Justin Williams, who is Director of the African American Studies program and Professor of History, for coordinating this event and bringing such an important discussion to our campus community. Tonight's event reflects the importance of liberal arts education, which is premised on free thought that requires a diversity of information, perspectives, peoples, cultures, beliefs, and histories. Focusing on Sudan takes us to the African continent, which generally remains peripheral to the U.S. view of global political, social, and economic considerations. And yet, Africa is the second largest continent by population with 1.52 billion people. Together with Asia, these peoples make up 77% of the global population. Nation states, such as Sudan, are critical to our understanding of the continent. Their current civil war should be of importance to us all, given our shared concern for all human beings. Specifically, the genocide occurring there violates basic tenets of international human rights. Such violence against a group of fellow human beings should also invite us to reflect back on our own nation state, to remember our history of genocide, and to consider how we can seek more peace, justice, care, and compassion for one another. At Detroit Mercy, we are called to the magis, the more, to push the boundaries of knowledge. Tonight's conversation about Sudan highlights and spotlights how we should always push to know more about the peoples, places, and practices that constitute our global community and reaffirm our commitment to humanity. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Dean Barichka, for your amazing leadership and steadfast support for the African American Studies program here at University of Detroit Mercy. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to, seeing you at more events at Chaz as well. And congratulations on all the amazing hard work that you've done in the last year with that transition. To give some context for the event and Professor Tounsel's talk, I just wanted to give you a sense of the basic situation based on some recent New York Times reporting. And I'm paraphrasing here. The current civil war in Sudan has, by some estimates, killed 150,000 people and forced more than 11 million others from their homes. The U.S. government has declared that a genocide has been perpetrated by the Rapid Support Forces, and the war, which has drawn in foreign countries and a host of other armed groups, now threatens to spill over Sudan's borders. After more than 2 years of fighting, thousands have been killed in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Countless women and girls have been subjected to sexual violence, and millions are hungry in the world's first officially declared famine since 2020. The United Nations now says Sudan is home to the world's worst displacement crisis. Here to take us beyond the headlines and give us critical historical context is Christopher Tounsel, Associate Professor of History, Director of Graduate Studies, and Director of the African Studies program at the University of Washington. Professor Tounsel is a historian of modern Sudan, with special focus on race and religion as political technologies. His first book, Chosen Peoples: Christianity and Political Imagination in South Sudan, was published by Duke University Press and named a finalist for the Association of the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora's Outstanding First Book Award. And it was also a finalist for the Christianity Today Book Award. Dr. Tounsel's second book, Bounds of Blackness, African American Sudan and the Politics of Solidarity, was published with Cornell University Press in 2024 and received an honorable mention for the International Studies Association Book Award. In addition to his research, Professor Tounsel has provided commentary on current events in Sudan and South Sudan for outlets including the BBC, Al Jazeera, Human Rights Watch, and NPR. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Tounsel.
Thank you so much, Justin, for that introduction, and thank you so much to Dean Jocelyn for that wonderful introduction as well. I am honored to be in your presence virtually today, and I look forward to presenting. So I am about to share my screen and begin the slideshow. Quote, all over the country, the flags of the condominium governments were lowered for the first time, and the new independence flag of blue, yellow, and green were hoisted in their place. The reports from all provinces speak of the profound emotion attending the various ceremonies, of rousing speeches by distinguished citizens, of prayer, of music, and of revelry, end quote. These words were recorded in the Sudan Monthly Record newspaper in early 1956. For 57 years, England and Egypt had governed the massive territory known as the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium as a virtual colony. But by the mid-1950s, however, the Sudanese successfully ushered in the winds of change that swept the rest of Africa into flame. On January the 1st, 1956, Sudan became the first colony in sub-Saharan British Africa to wrest free from Her Majesty's yoke and become a sovereign nation. Prime Minister Ismail el-Azadi had the honor of raising the Sudanese flag at an independence ceremony in the new national capital of Khartoum. And emblazoned in blue, yellow, and green, each color was imbued with symbolic import. The blue representing the Nile, so central to Sudan's ancient and modern history. Green representing agriculture, no doubt a foundational part of the new nation's economic and social future, and yellow for the Sahara sand that stretched across Sudan's landscape. On January the 1st, 1956, no city in the world shone brighter than Khartoum. But today, no place is more tragic. Since the outbreak of civil war 2 years ago, again, as Professor Williams already stated, more than 100,000 people are estimated to have been killed and more than 8 million displaced, amounting to the world's worst displacement crisis. 25 million are in need of humanitarian assistance, and Sudan now dons the unenviable mantle of being the hungriest country on earth. So what is the historical background that led to this war? Why has the media been surprisingly so silent? And what does the future hold for one of Africa's largest countries? To begin, it's important to know that the present trauma, of course, did not emerge from a vacuum. Sudan has had more coups than any other African nation. Since gaining independence in 1956, Sudanese coups have occurred in 1958, 1969, 1985, 1989, 2019, and again in 2021. The 1989 coup brought Omar al-Bashir, the man pictured to the left, to power for what became a 3-decade autocratic period of rule in which civilians suffered from the typical excesses of strongman rule, right? With the presence of secret police, repressions of political opposition, and corruption. And so Bashir's 2019 ouster was shocking to many observers, myself included, who assumed that he would simply cling to power for the rest of his life or conversely be forcibly removed by assassination. But any hopes that his downfall would result in democracy were ultimately short-lived. In 2021, when elections were slated to be held, the army decided to take power for itself, claiming that it was stepping in to avert a civil war. And so the current conflict revolves around infighting between two rival groups. The Sudanese army, known in kind of shorthand as the SAF or Sudanese Armed Forces, and a paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF in short. And since the 2021 coup ended a transitional government put in place after Bashir's removal, Sudan has effectively been run by the army, with coup leader General Abdel Fattah Burhan, the man pictured to the right, ruling as the de facto ruler. Now, the Rapid Support Forces, which is led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who is known by the name of Hemeti and is the man pictured in the left in the kind of tan brown suit there, had previously worked alongside the Sudanese army to help keep the military in power. And following Bashir's 2019 removal, the political transition was supposed to result in elections by the end of 2023, with Burhan promising a transition to civilian rule. But it unfortunately appears that neither Burhan nor Hemeti has any intention of relinquishing power. The two men disagreed on how rapid support forces should be incorporated into the Sudanese armed forces. And tensions boiled over when the RSF began deploying members of its paramilitary force around the country and in the capital city of Khartoum without the army's express consent. And added to these tensions were concern over the rapid support forces seeking to control more of the country's economic assets, including and most notably its gold mines. The power struggle between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces exploded in April of 2023, right? So we're coming up on what is a very sordid 2-year anniversary, when the RSF and the SAF began engaging each other in gunfights, not just in Khartoum, but really elsewhere throughout the country as well. Right. And of course, the fighting has been very terrible, right? With really the kind of region in the country that some would argue, right, would say has been worst hit is in Darfur, which is the very large kind of region to the west of the country that borders the nations of Chad and the Central African Republic. For those of you perhaps familiar with the Darfur genocide, which occurred in the early 2000s, right? Really 2003 and 2004. The group that was most responsible for perpetrating that genocide of non-Arab ethnic groups actually involved this group known as the Janjaweed of which Hemeti, the current RSF leader, was a part, right? The Janjaweed was this kind of paramilitary group that was hired by President Omar al-Bashir to stamp out an anti-government rebellion. And so Hemeti and other members of the Janjaweed, basically with the authority of then President Bashir, went on a scorched earth campaign against a lot of these kind of Black identifying ethnic groups in Darfur, right? It was considered the 21st century's first genocide, right? And really kind of compelled this massive worldwide effort known as the Save Darfur movement to bring attention to it. In a very grotesque way, Darfur continues to be the region most affected by this war, right? Where you've got members of the Rapid Support Forces in some ways trying to continue or even quote unquote finish the job, right? That was begun in the early 2000s, right? And so this map kind of shows the fact that a lot of refugee sites, right, have been built just across the border in Chad, right? And that you've got thousands, if not millions, of internally displaced peoples still remaining in Darfur itself, those being the kind of orange spots there. Right. Now, one of the biggest stories that has emerged from the war has been the media's coverage relative to other ongoing crises. According to the analytics firm Chartbeat, coverage from Sudan actually peaked in April of 2023, right? So right when the war was beginning. That month, again, April 2023, approximately 3,000 media companies across 70 countries published 7,000 new articles on Sudan. However, from January to May 2024, the number of new Sudan-related articles plummeted, excuse me, to just 600 per month. And by comparison, coverage of the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza had not gone below 100,000 per month at any point. And so to what then may we attribute this startling imbalance of coverage? To many, the answer is clear. Clean, old-fashioned racism. World Health Organization Director Tedros Ghebreyesus has blamed the world's neglect of Sudan on racism, telling the BBC that he did not believe that Sudan was getting appropriate attention and that the same was true with other cases in Africa. He said, quote, "I think race is in play here. That's what I feel now. We see the pattern now," end quote. Former Representative Jamal Bowman of New York's 16th Congressional District stated that, quote, "We always uplift and talk about and center the Western hegemonic imperial power structure, which tends to be white nations like Israel and Ukraine and others," end quote. Now, conversely, former Representative Bowman added that situations in predominantly Black and brown countries are comparatively ignored or suppressed as part of what he believes to be a white supremacist narrative. Representative Sidney Kamlager-Dove, who represents California's 37th Congressional District, opined that, quote, "Africa always seems like an afterthought," end quote, and has labeled the situation in Sudan as being tragic. Representative Kamlager-Dove's words about Africa's apparent irrelevance were striking, given her role as a member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Writing for Forbes, Cameroonian American journalist Janice Asare has opined that lack of media coverage for crises impacting darker-skinned people could be attributed to the industry's racial empathy bias, which is essentially a prejudice resulting in decreased sentiment for Black people's pain as compared to the suffering of our non-Black counterparts, right? And so amid this perception that racism is responsible for the media's lack of coverage of the Sudan, as an African American historian of Sudan, it's difficult to ignore the irony that a country long known as the land of the Blacks occupies, in fact, a racially ambiguous status in many Western racial epistemologies. And perhaps nothing exemplifies this more than confusion over whether or not Sudan is actually North African, Sub-Saharan African, Arab, Black, or a mix of all of the above, right? Mahmoud Mamdani has noted that the transatlantic slave trade racialized notions of Africa and fueled the conceptual tendency to envision the Sahara as the continent's dividing line, as a type of civilizational barrier, if you will, below or, quote, Negro Africa, end quote. Hegel's writings exemplified the emphasis on slavery's role in demarcating this separation, deeming that true Africa was the land where slaves were captured, that Northeast Africa was essentially this Nilotic land that he linked with Asia, and that North Africa was in fact, quote, European Africa, right? And so I think it's clear here, right, that under such delineations, the boundaries defining what constitutes, quote, real Africa from other degrees of a perceived Africanness are historical in nature and very directly defined by the legacies of slavery and race. And for those with the Hegelian propensity to detach North Africa from Sub-Saharan Africa, lack of consensus regarding Sudan's regional positioning is further complicated by its Arab and African heritages, right, brought forth by slavery, marriage, and intermixing going back several centuries. By 1939, none other than sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois typified Sudan's nebulous perception when he penned the following words in his essay, Black Folk Then and Now. Quote, in what is known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, the Sudan is left as a sort of historical no man's land and is now regarded as Arabian, now as Egyptian, and always not worth careful investigation, end quote. But one demographic, however, was and continues to be invested in approaching Sudan as an example of Black excellence, and that is African Americans. Decades before W.E.B. Du Bois penned those words, Black Americans were attracted to the ancient Nile and its Egyptian and Sudanic kingdoms. And in the 19th century, Black authors looked to the ancient civilizations of Kush and Nubia as being important to understanding Black cultural predecessors. This history of power gave context for those Black writers who claimed the right to possess civilization and culture against a broader context of slavery and humiliation. And while the ancient Nile still wields symbolic import for many African Americans today, the community's attention to Sudan is not confined to its ancient past. And so beginning with the early 20th century and continuing through Barack Obama's presidency, My recently published book, Bounds of Blackness, African Americans, Sudan, and the Politics of Solidarity, explores the history of African American engagements with modern Sudan. There, I write that Sudan is an important example of how malleable transnational racial solidarity can be when socio-political changes occur in a single space over time. In the African American purview, Sudanese colonialism and independence has presented different racialized heroes and villains. And this development is important for showing the capricious nature of racial solidarity and Black America's relationship with the Arab world beyond the West Bank. In telling this story, I feature a variety of individuals and organizations, including graduates of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, who traveled to Sudan in the early 1900s for a cotton cultivation project. Pan-African activist Islanda Robeson, right, pictured in kind of the bottom center here, who stopped in Sudan during her 1930s tour of Africa. U.S. Foreign Service worker Arthur McCaw, who helped steer U.S.-Sudan relations in its early post-colonial days. And Susan Page, a Chicago-born diplomat who served as the first U.S. ambassador to South Sudan. But notwithstanding each of the roles that such figures play, no single character looms larger in the history of Black America's relationship with Sudan, past and present, than the luminous giant known as the Black press. Throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, and really continuing to the present day, right? African American newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and the Final Call were the richest areas to explore Black opinion on the modern Nile. While Sudan's colonial period, during Sudan's colonial period, Black newspapers often framed the country as Black racial kin under race-based state oppression. And following the Second World War, Black editorials speculated on Sudan's uncertain political future. And when it became independent in 1956 and evolved into its first civil war, Black newspapers reported on the conflict. And at the turn of the 21st centuries, periodicals like the Nation of Islam's Final Call to Howard University's Hilltop student newspaper reported on the Second Sudanese Civil War and the genocide in Darfur. As traditional Black media brands like Jet and Ebony Magazine have declined or disappeared altogether, online news media like The Griot and The Root have continued the legacy of providing African American audiences with Sudan-related content. Through it all, the diversity of Black print spaces that African American writers speaking on Sudan provided a particular definition of what it meant and means to be Black in the African diaspora. And with this kind of definition or definitions of Blackness, different stories about Black struggle, pride, and consciousness. The Black press's coverage of the current and ongoing Civil War provides an important texture to the argument that a racist media is to blame for its relative non-coverage of the current crisis. Several major African American media outlets have kept eyes on Sudan since April of 2023. News1.com, which is owned by the same digital media platform that runs sites like Bossip and Madame Noir and Black Planet, reposted my explainer of the conflict within days that the war erupted back in April of 2023. The conflict has been covered by The Root, by BET.com, by The Final Call, which has provided several articles for its readership on its website, and The Grio, which published its Sudan-related interviews with Representatives Bowman and Kamlager Dove. Political commentator Roland Martin, who has over 1.4 million subscribers on his YouTube channel, has devoted space on his show to discuss Sudan. And Blavity.com helped to promote a benefit show for Sudan featuring singer and rapper Black, right? Quote, "I love being Black and I promote being Black," he once shared. "And if something isn't right in the Black community, I'm speaking about it not being right. All we can do when things are crazy and all over the place is raise awareness," end quote. And then there is the platform formerly known as Twitter. One post with the phrase "all eyes on Sudan" has been seen by over 3 million people. And the hashtag Eyes on Sudan has also helped raise awareness. Now, of course, Black Americans have long used social media, right, as spaces for political engagement and social activism. And according to Pew Research Center surveys, Black social media users are particularly prone to convey that they find such sites important to them for getting involved with issues that they care about. And so while, of course, the Sudanese diaspora should be primarily credited for the success that hashtag Eyes on Sudan has generated, I think it's also important to note that African Americans have also engaged with Sudan on X as well. And perhaps the most notable example comes from Grammy-nominated R&B artist Summer Walker, who posted a lengthy statement on X back in November of 2022 I'm sorry, 2023, that included a call for an end to the war in Sudan. And Walker, for those of you who may know, has nearly 2 million followers on X. So where do things stand in Sudan at the moment, right? This kind of ever-evolving situation. Well, recently, what we do know is that the Sudan armed forces have scored a slew of victories, right? As of last month, the army controls much of the country's southeastern border with Ethiopia and the Red Sea coast, and with it, Sudan's strategically important Port Sudan on the Red Sea, as well as parts of Sudan's kind of metropolitan core located in the center of the country where the Blue and White Niles converge. Furthermore, the Sudan Armed Forces has reclaimed much of the White Nile and Jazeera provinces and has broken a Rapid Support Forces siege of North Kordofan's provincial capital of El Obeid. And then perhaps the most important development, the SAF has recaptured the Rapid Support Forces' last major stronghold in Khartoum, the presidential palace. And so each of these developments indicate that the SAF is taking an increasingly proactive approach in the war. And I think that such positive momentum can not only serve to reassure not just the Sudanese populace, but really the world at large, that the Sudanese armed forces is the country's strongest force, right? But it could also signal to foreign powers that it is and will continue to be the country's legitimate authority moving forward. However, right, there are indications that the RSF is in no rush to surrender, right? And that despite the Sudanese armed forces' recent, I guess, accomplishments or advances, the RSF has strengthened its control over nearly all of Darfur, right, in Western Sudan. It's here that the RSF has been accused of committing genocide against non-Arab communities. And only the besieged capital of North Darfur, El Fasher, stands in the way of total RSF hegemony in the region. The RSF also controls territory to the south, along Sudan's borders with the Central African Republic and South Sudan. And so the fact that the SAF and RSF are entrenched in their respective regional strongholds casts doubt on the significance of the SAF's recent victories. So in terms of what the future holds, right, I think there are certain elements that are clearer than others, but I've kind of picked three, and then I'm kind of happy to expound on these during the Q&A. We know that the post-war government's most urgent priority, right, once the guns finally go silent, will be first and foremost to provide humanitarian aid for the millions of Sudanese whose lives have been decimated by the war. Critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and other facilities that have been destroyed, need to be rebuilt for communities that remain and or will be returning to their homes. Security will have to be ensured for the millions of displaced persons, both at home and abroad. And the government will need to work with foreign governments and non-governmental agencies to open and protect pathways for food to be conveyed to the millions at risk of famine. Sudan's bilateral relationship with the United States under the Trump administration can have major implications for its relationships with other world powers. So we know that under the Joe Biden administration, the U.S. in fact surpassed its June 2020 pledge to provide $356 million to Sudan in development and humanitarian assistance. However, President Trump's 3-month freeze on foreign aid has already wrought havoc in Sudan, where a web of communal kitchens has already been forced to cease most of its work due to a lack of funding, 75% of which was provided by the U.S. Agency for International Development, also known as USAID. And so this kind of begs the question, to who will Sudan then turn to for foreign aid at this critical time when it most desperately needs it and when former channels of aid from the U.S. are now restricted, if not closed altogether? Well, what we've seen is that one indication is that Russia may become very important for Sudan's foreign policy moving forward. Russia plans to establish its first naval base in Africa on Sudan's Red Sea coast. And these plans have been confirmed by Sudan's foreign minister as recently as this past February. But finally, if past is indeed prologue, there are many precedents from Sudanese history that provide insight into the post-war government's domestic policy agenda. If a transitional government is to not only be formed, but also effectual in its work, the Sudanese government will have to buck a decades-old trend of military men wielding hegemonic power over the nation's political affairs. If free and fair elections are to be held, the government will have to convince the citizenry that the process will not be undercut by another coup in a country that has experienced over 33 attempted coups since 1956. If a civilian prime minister is to be appointed, it will only occur after a few short years since the last civilian prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok, was forced from office by the military. Last but not least, the government needs to resolve the issue that was principally responsible for kindling the April 2023 war in the first place, namely the future of the Rapid Support Forces. As Professor Williams mentioned, at the start of this event, the United States has formally accused the RSF of genocide and has sanctioned its leader, Hemeti, as well as Rapid Support Forces owned companies in the United Arab Emirates and individuals who acquired weapons for the RSF. Can the RSF be officially integrated with the Sudanese armed forces without damaging the post-war government's credibility on the world stage? Will the Sudanese government, which has yet to extradite former president and International Criminal Court indicted Omar al-Bashir to The Hague, actually be trusted to bring Rapid Support Forces figures accused of genocide to justice? Will the government be willing to try Sudanese armed forces members for similar war crimes conducted over the past 2 years? Given protesters' anger in autumn 2022, there were reports, or among reports, that amnesty was being considered for Hemeti and Burhan. Any peaceful post-war transition stands to be undermined if the individuals responsible for the horrors of the previous 2 years go unpunished. And so it is. Sudan, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to declare independence from Britain, now faces an existential crisis. The profound emotion of January the 1st, 1956, is now contrasted with the unimaginable grief of orphans, widows, and refugees. The rousing speeches that adorned the first Independence Day have been replaced by shrieks of terror, hunger, and gloom. Former prayers for glorious freedom have been replaced by appeals for ceasefire. Cheerful music is drowned out by songs of mourning, and revelry is overshadowed by despair. And while the war appears to be possibly and prayerfully approaching its twilight, the oracle of history shows that the post-war government will face significant challenges to ensure a lasting peace. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Tounsel. We really appreciate it. And as you alluded to here, we have some time for questions and answers. If you have a question for Dr. Tounsel, you can place it either in the chat or the Q&A section, and I'll relay it to him. Just to give people some time to start typing, I have a question.
Sure.
It's my understanding that the United Arab Emirates is a huge source of material support for the Rapid Support Forces. So I'm wondering, is there any movement globally or even among activists in the United States to put pressure on the UAE to end its support now that you have a formal declaration of genocide?
Yes. So there absolutely is, but it is not without its complications, right? So on one hand, the Sudanese government actually recently sued the UAE before the International Court of Justice, right? Under these claims, right, that it is effectively providing financial support for the genocide that has occurred, right? The issue, though, however, is that the UAE has historically been one of the United States' closest allies in the Middle East, particularly since the War on Terror began back in 2001, right? Um, for anyone who has been to Dubai, right, you will know that the UAE is an incredibly rich country, right, and a major economic power. And in terms of Sudan, very important because a lot of the gold that is mined from Sudan eventually flows through the UAE. So in some ways, the UAE is basically like a clearinghouse, if you will, for Sudanese gold. So that's just to say that on one hand, the UAE is receiving a lot of pressure, right, given its connections with the Rapid Support Forces. But what's tricky about it is that the UAE is a very close ally, not just to the United States, but to a lot of other countries in NATO. And so there comes this kind of classic dilemma of how do you bring um, a foreign ally to justice if they are a strategic partner in other ways, right? You know, which kind of becomes more important, the democratic ideals or the very practical economic and military strategic assistance that a country might provide, right? But absolutely, if you ask Sudanese activists in this country or in Canada, there's a lot of pressure that is being placed on the UAE, absolutely, and really, you know, reflects the fact that this is a regional conflict and not just one kind of restricted to the borders of Sudan.
Well, great, thank you. And we have a question here from Colin. He says, has religion also played a significant part on the conflict? It seems like culture slash ethnicity has been a big part, but I would be interested in hearing about other factors that have contributed.
So religion is absolutely a major factor. In an interesting way, when the conflict first broke out, Hemeti went on Twitter, right, saying that he was trying to basically protect the country from quote unquote the Islamists, right? So kind of ostensibly already framing his war effort as one to kind of, you know, protect this idea of religious freedom in Sudan. But for anyone who knows about the history of religious freedom in Sudan, they will say it hasn't really existed, right? Sudan, since its post-colonial period began in 1956, has really instituted some of the most harsh kind of um, policies, right, facing non-Muslims in the country, even to the point where in the 1980s and 90s, you had brief periods where, um, you know, Quranic law was used as the kind of jurisprudence to respond to crimes like, you know, theft and adultery, right? And so you had people being publicly whipped, stoned, even amputated for crimes like theft, right? So that's just to say that there's a way in which the 2019 ouster of Bashir, on one hand, was really kind of a sign of hope that, okay, we might have a chance at a civilian-led government that does not attempt to use religion as an exclusive arm or to execute kind of an exclusive vision of the country as Islamic, but to really show to the world, hey, we can do this thing called, you know, religiously pluralistic democracy. But unfortunately, since the war has begun, you've seen continued violence against Christians. And as a kind of last point on that, um, practically speaking, on the ground, what this has looked like in a really kind of interesting way is that churches have become sites of clashes between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces because when these forces are clashing, in many respects, the buildings in any town that are the largest, right, and can be used by a force to really protect themselves from artillery fire are mosques and churches. So it's really for the kind of, you know, at the moment, street to street, fighting that churches become these kind of scenes of crossfire, right? And so I've said, there's this African proverb when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. I think kind of nothing reflects that more than Sudanese churches being destroyed by virtue of rapid support forces and Sudanese armed forces fighting each other at these church compounds.
Right. And Christian says, Dr. Tounsel, thank you for your presentation. How do you judge the effectiveness of UN efforts in Sudan over the last 2 decades? And do you have any specific thoughts on the alphabet soup of nonprofits and international organizations that worked in Sudan in the years leading up to the outbreak of war 2 years ago?
Yes, and so this is really a microcosm, right, of kind of NGO activity throughout the world, right? Or sorry, throughout the African continent. When the war began in April 2023, you had this almost immediate onslaught of critique for non-governmental organizations like the UN for basically saying you could have prevented this, right? You could have put more pressure on the Sudanese government to really enforce and enact kind of principles and rules of law that reflect, true support for human rights, right? And that, in some ways, some of these organizations become how can I put it, more relevant when these zones are in conflict, right? Um, the UN has a very bad reputation in some ways within the Sudan, but then in other ways, right? When we're talking about millions and millions of internally displaced peoples, right? We know that without organizations like, the UN, the Red Cross, Islamic Crescent, or sorry, Red Crescent, Doctors Without Borders, right? That these very harrowing statistics of those, killed and wounded would be even worse, right? And so it's this kind of classic double-edged sword where NGOs on one hand represent, um, what some might call continued Western external intrusion, right? And kind of, you know, uh, institutional bodies that are really undermining post-colonial African sovereignty. But on the other hand, right, we know that Sudan has been impacted by things like climate change, right? That Sudan has experienced drought and famine, right? And that there are ways in which these organizations do work that kind of the average Sudanese outside of, Khartoum and Port Sudan are on the receiving end of. Um, so I'm not among the number that kind of blames, NGOs specifically for the outbreak of war. But I will say that I think there are some other, I'll just say, non-Sudanese state actors, if you will, who have a vested interest in the war continuing, right? And to be more explicit, I'll just say, for those countries who really need Sudanese gold, really need Sudanese oil, right? Who see the Red Sea coast, which remains to this day one of the world's most important commercial waterways, right? There are a lot of states around the world who kind of want their person to come out on top and are not necessarily interested in peace for the sake of peace.
And Iman says Africa is starving is a commonly recurring phenomenon, so it fails to get attention because it seems unsolvable. I am 50 and watch starving Somalian children on TV, then Ethiopian, and now what feels like and is decades Sudan. How come there are so few hopeful stories coming out of Africa? Or are those stories not making it to the quote unquote white media? I am a 50-year-old white female who reads the BBC, CNN, and the Detroit Free Press daily.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. There's actually a book that just recently came out on African journalism. The name of it escapes me, but I really appreciate this question because it does speak to the power of media, right? And as someone who is married to a media professor, I can tell you that the news industry is just that, an industry. It is a business, right? We do know that things like number of clicks matter, right? We know that viewership matters. We know that this matters not just in terms of who sponsors what, but what stories are literally, right, seen as more marketable than others, right? And I'm not talking about fake news versus non-fake news. I'm literally talking about producers meeting in a boardroom and saying, yes, we have a choice of these 6 stories that we can highlight during this half an hour show. Which 6 will we do it? Some get chosen, some don't, right? Um, there is, in fact, a phenomenon that you are speaking about, right? About a kind of like, um, I'll just say, exhaustion of pain, right? Where people can be numbed by, oh, this country again is engaged in a civil war, or this country again is in famine, right? But I think what's really important is that there are lots of familiar stories around the world that continue to be beamed to the US public, despite the fact that they're not necessarily new, right? And so I think that this is where the importance of race really comes into play, right? Um, Without naming names, I'll just say that there are certain kind of hotspots in the world that continue to receive the lion's share of media attention, despite the fact that the conflicts have raged for years and years and years, even decades, right? Um, so I do think that on one hand, the kind of familiar media depictions of Africa as a place of pain, corruption, civil war, um, have roots in colonialism, right? And kind of serve serve Western interests to the extent that it kind of justifies this sense of, oh, they need us, right? We are justified in kind of exploiting, extracting, serving as the kind of humanitarian benefactor, if you will, for this whole continent, right? Um, so I hope that that kind of answers the question. Yeah.
All right, great. Are there any more questions? We'll wait just a second here.
Sure, yeah, no,
You don't want to cut off someone that's furiously typing.
yeah, no, yeah, and I appreciate the questions that have been asked, yeah. Um and During the pause, I can just say in terms of kind of recommended news sources that I would kind of, put out there for those of you who kind of want to get, I'll just say, a more holistic, lens of what's going on in Sudan. There's a lot of sources, including The Conversation, right, which is one that kind of, PhDs contribute content to, the BBC, Al Jazeera, I would say NPR, right? The main point being, I would recommend engaging as many news sources as you can so as not to kind of only believe one, right? Get a sense of all of the perspectives and then make your own judgments as opposed to just relying on one news outlet.
Okay, and Jinnah asked, what action should we take regarding UAE's involvement in the Sudanese war? This far in, what are some forms of holding them accountable that we can take?
Absolutely. One, vote. If you have the power to vote, put pressure on your elected leaders, right? So, if write to your congressperson and say, hey, I want the US to, send less support to the UAE or to force the ambassador of the UAE to testify before Congress and to speak to its financial relationship with Sudan, right? We, as the kind of, citizenry, have that right to put that pressure on our elected officials, right? Um, as someone who is active on social media, I would say never underestimate the power of a tweet or retweet, right? So there are ways in which we can kind of be, our own micro broadcasters, right? So that if we read a story from a trusted source, right, that speaks to UAE complicity in the Sudanese civil war, broadcast that, right? I would also say, given the fact that this is a primarily academic audience, I would say being informed in the arena of higher education, right? So take those courses on modern Middle Eastern history, right? Take those courses on post-colonial and colonial history, right? There is a way in which the average American knows what it knows about the Middle East through CNN and not their local professor at their college, right? I think we should switch that, right? That's not to say I don't think CNN is trustworthy, but it is to say that a news media company is that, and higher ed is that, and they don't necessarily have the same objectives, goals, right? Um, so I think one, writing to your congressperson, two, voting, right? Three, staying informed, right?
Great. And Pauline says, what will it take for the world to change then? Change in respect to more equal treatment and conversation relative to Ukraine, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think there's a lot of kind of directions to take that, but I think in terms of kind of what I shared about the power of the media, I would say, it really starts with us. And I think that these statistics bear out that, since January of 2025, some constituents have watched more news, some constituents have watched less news, right? But the point is that anytime we turn on our smartphone, our laptop, right, we have the power, right, to type in what we want, right? The algorithms are built in such a way that it will feed you more of what it thinks you will be interested in, right? So the more that you search Sudan, right, the more that you search UAE, the more things will be drawn to you, right? And so, my hope, right, of course, is I'm going to make a positive assumption for all of us on this Zoom. We want peace around the whole world, right? So I'm not saying don't focus on Ukraine, don't focus on Gaza, right? What I am saying is that in a kind of media ecosystem where certain kind of tragic regions on Earth are not being highlighted as much as others, then our explicit and conscious decision to read and learn more about what's not being as reported becomes political, right? And so in terms of how things get better, I think it starts with being informed because you can only change and you can only be passionate about what you know, right? So I think it starts with kind of what we decide to read, what we decide to watch, and what we decide to listen to on a daily basis that will then bear fruit in the actions that we take to change the world and to be and to bring an end to conflicts like those that are going on in Sudan.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tounsel. There's so many great comments in the chat, congratulating you on such a great and informative session. And I'd also like to thank our dear Dean, Jacqueline Barichka, for her wonderful words of welcome and ongoing support for programs like this. And I would like to thank the amazing audience. I think one of the silver linings you should take is that you have become part of the solution tonight. If you're saying, why don't more people care about this? You saw this event, you came and you attended, you engaged, and you got more informed. So, let's make it contagious and keep spreading the word. If you're interested in more events like this, please follow the African American Studies program on either Instagram or Facebook. You can also send me an email. And we want to thank everyone that attended in Detroit and around the country. So feel free to come and see us sometime in Detroit if you're not here right now, though. We appreciate it and have a good night, everyone.
All right, thank you.